Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to be kicking off 2025 with the ambitious goal of mastering productivity in the modern age. The goal here will be to understand productivity and build a system to suit your needs using modern tooling. With that in mind, why exactly are we doing this? Well, first of all, this is you. You are surrounded by a complex series of habits, priorities, influences, mindset, and other things. And maybe you have a goal. Maybe your goal is, I want to have a working MVP for my app by June of 2025. But what ends up happening is you build out these goals, but then some shiny fun task comes along and diverts your attention and your focus and your productivity in a completely different direction. And so the goal then becomes, and the why for creating a productivity system, therefore, is to take that shiny fun task and point it in the direction of those goals. That way, your productivity and your interest and your focus and your attention are diverted towards the things that you think actually matter in your life. So, a bit of background on the situation. So, for me, 2024 started with good intentions and got a little bit out of hand. And what that means is that I started the year with a couple of different changes that I wanted to make to bring my life into a bit more order. One of those changes was to stick to my word a little bit more. When I made a commitment, I would actually go through with it. So if I was going to tell somebody that I was going to work on a project, then I was going to get that project done. And on top of that, I also wanted to have more of a routine, and I wanted to dedicate time and actually focus on these projects. And when I made that kind of commitment to build something, I would see it through. Now, that was great, but what ended up happening is that over the course of the year, sure, I was committed to my projects, but then more and more projects were added to my plate, to the point where I had maybe 2 to 5 to 7 projects going on at any given time, and while a lot of them got to a somewhat completed state, there were also a lot which kind of got left in the back burner with no real end in sight and no real completion in sight. And so while 2024 started with those good intentions of staying focused and committed, it also got a little bit out of hand, and I ended up having too much on my plate. On top of that, there was a lot of distraction generally, and so I wasn't able to necessarily complete everything that I wanted to get done. With that said, this video in particular is actually going to be a neat bow on 2024. Because of what I mentioned, there were a lot of things that I wanted to get done and I didn't necessarily get done, but this video is going to be the thing which brings all of them together into one cohesive completion of 2024, at least for me. And so that's just one thing that I want to mention right off the bat. And for those of you who are on Substack and seeing this video on Substack, this is also a video to kind of introduce a new style that I'm going to be utilizing more often. There will still be written articles on Substack, and for those of you on YouTube who don't know about the Substack, it'll be linked below, and it's called Software and Synapses. Basically, I'm going to be transitioning more to illustrated video content and video essays such as this one. So, that is going to be a new direction, and there will still be written articles, but you can expect a bit of a transition towards this kind of content, which can also be posted on YouTube, which will overall be better for the publication. With that said, in terms of productivity systems, I have tried a lot of things. For example, last year I decided to try GTD, which is getting things done, and that system definitely inspired me in a lot of different ways, and it did work, except it just wasn't good enough for me. I am so easily distracted, and also it becomes very, very easy for me to filter things out. And so even though I liked GTD, and I took a while to set up a complete system in Obsidian, which is my knowledge base application, I found that the friction of adding a new task every single time got overwhelming. And so when I started to actually add these tasks to my Obsidian notes and then tried to develop this system, it was technically working, but the amount of friction for each individual task was enough for me to just stop using it altogether. And then I didn't stay committed to it to the point where, because it wasn't automatically managed and I had to do that, it ended up failing. And a lot of that is on me because I simply didn't utilize the system as it should have been utilized. Because it wasn't for me, I want to build something that will work for me. And a lot of that comes down to personalization. With that said, because I have failed many times to build a productivity system, I want to go through some key points of things that I have learned, things that are successful. Because even though I haven't necessarily built a cohesive productivity system for myself yet, I still have managed to get things done. And I've learned a lot about productivity on the way. So let's go through some of those key points. First of all, it's important to consider mindset. There are many different mindsets that you can take, and they all affect the way that you are going to approach productivity at a very fundamental level. First of all, there's this concept of a growth mindset. Growth mindset seems to be one of those kind of buzzwordy kind of things that a lot of those business presentation and type videos will talk about, but it is important. And the concept is essentially when you come to a problem, or when you come to a task that you need to complete, or when you see a path before you that might be difficult, do you immediately think, that is too hard for me, and because I am the way that I am, I cannot do that thing, or I cannot go down that path? Or do you think this is something for me to grow into? Growth mindset is about being able to grow into new situations and approach tasks as growing opportunities rather than thinking of yourself as a rigid set of skills and abilities that cannot overcome new tasks. Additionally, there's learning style. You've got visual, auditory, kinesthetic, etc. Basically, your particular learning style, the way that you take in information and the way that you understand and intuit information, is going to be huge for how you actually approach productivity. The different tasks that you need to complete, the way that the tools are actually laid out, the way that their information is organized for you is all going to be significantly affected by your learning style. For me, I think that, and this is probably for a lot of other people as well, there's a combination of all of these different factors, and different types of information are best understood in specific ways. For example, if somebody was going to try to teach me how to, or if I wanted to learn how to do construction or how to build complex architectures or things like that, or even just do some basic carpentry, kinesthetic learning is going to be the absolute best way to do that. Getting your hands actually on the wood and working it, and then using different tools and understanding how they all work and operate. Actually doing things and touching things with your hands is huge. That said, there are also visual learners. People might be extremely drawn to illustrations or graphs or visual explanations like 3 Blue 1 Brown videos when it comes to things like math, or other types of videos where people are using whiteboards to try to visualize different geometries or equations. Visual learners make a lot of sense. And then there's auditory learners, and auditory learning can be something like, well, maybe you're learning about history, maybe you're learning a story. There is a lot to be said about auditory learning. And so your learning style does matter, but it's also important to consider that you're not just going to be one learning style, but a lot of the time, different information is best consumed in a form that is intuitive and makes sense. Next, we've got early bird versus night owl. Some people simply prefer to work at night. I'm recording this at 12:07 a.m. as we speak, so I guess I could call myself a night owl. Some people, like my wife, are early birds. They like to get up at a very early time, and they start their day and they feel productive early in the morning. A lot of it comes down to, when can you actually focus? Because for me, at least, being a night owl is mostly a product of everything being too busy during the day for me to actually get in my head and focus. However, a lot of it also comes down to how your energy levels end up playing out. Some people simply have more energy during the night hours, whereas other people have more in the morning. And it could be a combination of both. Again, this isn't about confining yourself, it's about understanding yourself. Lastly, in this particular category, we've got the proclivity to distraction. How easily distracted are you? And it's important to be honest with yourself here because, frankly, most of us are very easily distracted, especially when you're considering the newer generations like Gen Z to Gen Alpha and now Gen Beta. We're all constantly hit by a sea of information and different things grabbing for our attention. So being distracted makes total sense, but understand where you are right now. Are you able to keep your focus very well, or are you easily distracted? That's going to affect how you approach your productivity system, because later on we'll talk about the idea of filtering out the noise, and you need to know how much noise you need to filter. So, next up, I'd like to talk about goals. Goals are a key component to a successful productivity system for all of the reasons that you've probably heard throughout your entire life. Really, what a goal is, and this is something that I have tried to avoid for a very long time, but I'm finally coming around to, is something which takes a hope or a desire or a priority or some measurable phenomenon that means something to you and grounds it so that when you're working on things, you can orient yourself towards that thing. Now, this is very important because this essentially allows you to actually work in the direction of something that is going to be beneficial to you or something that is going to be meaningful to you. And so we all kind of have goals implicitly or explicitly, but being explicit about them can be extremely beneficial if you want that kind of clarity. A lot of productivity or a lot of clearing your own mind comes down to externalizing it a bit and relying on outside sources, at least a bit, to clearly define certain internal phenomena or internal processes. So with that said, how do we actually do goals? Well, one thing about goals is that they should be SMART, and this is a framework that I've seen kind of prominently online, so I can't say that I've used it too much myself, but it makes a lot of sense. And it's essentially, here's how you take a goal and you make it really clear and allow yourself to work towards it in a specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound way. Now, we'll get back into what specifically this means, but just briefly to describe a SMART goal, it should be specific in that you know exactly what the goal is. It should be measurable in that there are quantifiable metrics that you can perform to know not only whether the goal has been accomplished or not, but also where on the timeline or where you are currently. It should be achievable, meaning that it's not some outrageous goal like make $1 billion by the end of the year. Because, I mean, maybe you could do that, but for me, that's definitely not something that I would consider achievable. It should be relevant, so it shouldn't just be like, I want to learn how to ride an elephant into the Amazon River by next week. Maybe that's relevant to you, but it's not relevant to me, so I wouldn't, it should be something that is actually going to bring you towards your priorities, and it should be based on your priorities and your overall meaning in your life. And then it should be time bound, so you should have an idea of when this should actually be accomplished. Goals should also be prominent and accessible, but not necessarily too noisy. So that's a difficult balance to strike. But essentially what we mean there is that goals should be extremely prominent in whatever system you have, just meaning that they are a primary object where you can just kind of find them very easily. And they're also supposed to be something which everything else anchors to. So it should be very clear in whatever user interface you might end up building, if you do build a user interface, or just in your mind, or in whatever system you decide to build out here. A goal should be very accessible. It should be very easy to find, and it should also be prominent so that it's something that you kind of keep going back to. But avoiding the noisy part is important, because it shouldn't be something that you learn to tune out. And if it's too noisy, and if it's popping up all the time when your brain decides that it's not useful, then your brain's going to just start tuning it out generally, and you're not going to have a good time because your goal is going to be pointless. Second, there should be some prioritization to this whole thing, basically meaning that your goals are based on your priorities. You have a lot of priorities implicitly and explicitly, and so it's important that you not only prioritize your goals, but you also base your goals on your priorities. Next, cognitive load. Cognitive load is one of those things that you kind of have to fight with, because you really want to just keep taking in all of this information, but in reality, you can only take in, and you should only take in, so much information. So it's kind of about like focus. What do you actually want to focus on? Your brain can take in a ton of information, and it does. Unless you have a disability, you have your eyes, which take in all of this visual stimuli. You have your ears, which take in all of this auditory stimuli, and you have your touch senses, and you have your sense of orientation, and then you have all of your different thoughts coming in, and all of these are coming in, and then your brain has to process it. And so the more that your brain has to process, maybe it can, but the less resources it can devote to each individual stream of information. And so it's very important to actually take your focus and your attention and devote it very specifically, but also don't overwhelm yourself, because if you take on, it's like taking too big of a bite of steak, and then you realize, well, shoot, I'm going to have to spit part of this out because I took such a big bite of steak, or maybe it's a chewy steak, it wasn't well cooked. You end up having to spit some of it out, and you can't actually chew the whole thing, and so you don't get as much value out of that whole resource that you tried to read or listen to or watch, because you tried to take too much information in. Give yourself a break, So a lot of it is about minimizing information intake to the point where it's actually useful. A lot of this also comes down to prioritization. Again, prioritization is a common theme. We'll see a lot throughout this lecture or presentation or whatever you want to call it. Prioritization is essentially, what do I actually want to spend my focus and attention on versus what probably isn't useful whatsoever. And then the great filter essentially being this concept of like all of this information coming in, going back to that idea of the attention economy. Literally everything is trying to, maybe not literally everything, but literally every device that you have, which is somehow connected to the internet, is trying to get your attention. That's part of the point of it. So basically blocking most information out, and a lot of that comes down to notifications, by the way, but basically blocking most of that out just so that the important stuff gets through. And that's the great filter. Only letting the important stuff through. Next, we're going to go through another useful buzzword, which is mindfulness. Mindfulness, I don't even necessarily want to just call it a useful buzzword. It seems like a pretty solid movement overall. But essentially, mindfulness seems to be just taking a second and thinking about your thinking. Taking a second and zooming out. Taking a look at yourself in the third person, in a way. And a lot of this comes down to pretty, ancient practices, I would say, things like meditation, things like prayer. If you are a religious person, then those kinds of things would probably be pretty useful to lean on for mindfulness. But if you're not, if you want to take a more secular approach, it pretty much comes down to grounding yourself in your feet. Ground yourself in your hands and your actual feeling. A lot of mindfulness comes down to just kind of being aware of what you're currently doing. And so slowing down and thinking about your thinking, slowing down and thinking about where you're currently at, slowing down, thinking about maybe, wow, I do have so many distractions coming in, slowing down, thinking about your feelings, slowing down, thinking about your current concentration levels, slowing down and thinking about, all of the things that you've actually done today. Just take a moment and sort of reflect and zoom out a little bit and slow down. Now, I will mention on this real quick, from a religious point of view, but also from a point of view that I think can be adopted secularly if you want, I do a weekly Sabbath, and this is a very common tradition. Essentially, once a week, take a good 24 hours. I would say you could take probably between 14 and 24 hours and just don't do any work and cut yourself entirely off from the world. No electronics, minimal stimuli overall. Don't do any work, but also just kind of reflect. And there are obviously a ton of different principles that you can utilize. There's a whole religion that has this outlined, but I would say just maybe consider something like that, where you are taking a dedicated time every week to just take a step back, turn off the world, put it on pause, and just reflect and rest. So, discipline. Real quick, want to just... Okay, yeah. Discipline. So, with discipline, it's very, very important to remember that there are all these tips and tricks that you're going to get in productivity. There are all of these tools that make promises to you. They say they're going to increase your productivity by 10x, or, they're going to eliminate all these distractions for you, or, they're going to help you control your impulses, or they're going to help build habits for you. All of these different things, and all of those things are very nice. But here's the problem. Ultimately, it comes down to you. Ultimately, it comes down to whether or not you can control your own impulses. And so that's kind of what productivity comes down to ultimately, is how much discipline will you actually have. All of these tools can be really, really useful. All of these systems can be really, really useful, but this is the foundation. And this comes down to the fundamental idea is that of you needing to master yourself, or your impulses will enslave you. You will simply be controlled by your habits. You will be controlled by your subconscious desires. You will be controlled by these quick jolts in certain directions, and you won't actually get yourself anywhere because you won't have much agency outside of those impulses. So a lot of that comes down to, can you control yourself? Can you tell yourself no? So that's something to ask yourself, and it is a crucial step in productivity. This comes down to self-responsibility. There is a lot to be said about the amount of distractions in the world, all of the things that are making it extremely difficult for us to be healthy and for us to be productive and for us to be, mentally well. But let's not be too easy on ourselves, because frankly, we do have this agency ourselves. We have a responsibility to ourselves to make our own lives what we want them to be. So let's take on that self-responsibility and allow ourselves to be disciplined and actually take control of our lives. With that said, a productivity system also needs to be constrained and not tyrannical. The idea here is kind of what I hinted at earlier with GTD, which is it kind of became another thing on my plate. That is, you're going to have a little bit of overhead from any productivity system, but the idea is that it should be a platform for you to go be productive, not another thing on your plate that might provide some organization to your life. The goal is to be more productive. So if you're going to be more productive, And you can't be bogging yourself down with a system which sounded nice when you were designing it, and you had all of this motivation, and you were like, oh my gosh, look at all these different cool systems that I have. Look at this template I made for a new task. Look at this different this flow chart I made that I can look at anytime that I want to know what I should be prioritizing at this given time, and then you never end up using it. It shouldn't look like that, because ultimately what you want to build isn't just some system of organization that you're going to have to constantly maintain. You want to build a platform that just feels like you should use it that way. Very difficult to design something like that, but that is the key to the good design. It should just fit in, and it should be the platform. So it shouldn't be another thing on your plate. Additionally, it's important to remember that with any system and with productivity more generally, consistency is more important than perfection or regularity. And so what I mean by that is, like, you're going to be tempted to set yourself a daily schedule or daily routine. And we'll get into routine later, because routine is very important. But say you set a weekly goal. I want to do this every week. Once a week, I'm going to go through and I'm going to just check off all of my low-hanging fruit to-dos. And every week, I am going to make sure that I have all of my different, records perfectly organized. Or every week, I'm going to do this. Every week, I'm going to do that. I mean, one thing that I set for myself last year is every week I was going to post a blog post. And you could also do something like, okay, every single time that I have any task, I'm going to put it into the system. That way, every single task that I ever do is tracked, and we're all good to go there. So the thing is, consistency is much more important there. You want to make sure that generally, once a week, you manage to go through and check off all of your undone tasks, maybe, if that's your goal. You want to make sure that generally when you have a task, it's in your system. But the consistency of that, building up that pattern, is much more important than actually tracking everything granularly to the fine detail, because that's going to get really, really tyrannical. That's going to get really, really difficult to actually achieve really fast. Life gets in the way, life gets sucky, and frankly, you're probably just not going to have the motivation, or you're probably just going to make a mistake, or you're probably not going to care enough at some point, and you're not going to do it perfectly, or you're going to skip something that you had scheduled, and then all of a sudden, that might throw you into a tailspin where you think, well, okay, what's the point? I missed that deadline that I was supposed to have, or I forgot to put that task into my system, so now what's the point in putting any task in the system? That's why consistency is much, much more important. And so this is also why you kind of have to be reflective and think, well, okay, if it's harder to actually keep up with this productivity system than having none at all, then maybe it's time to change it. And a lot of this is going to be, there's going to be some onboarding to your whole productivity system, and it's going to take some time to develop the habits to actually make it happen. But it is also important to take a step back and question whether or not it's actually helping you. And if it's not, maybe it's time to change it. And so it should also be frictionless. This is kind of what we were getting into before, is like, you really need to have a system that feels like this is how it should be. It shouldn't feel like this is how I feel like it needs to be. I didn't say that right. You shouldn't have a system where it's like, this is how ideally it would be, but I can't keep up with it, because every single time that I need to add a task, I have to go in, I have to fill out this whole form, and then I have to put it into the right folder and all of these different things. What it should feel like is it should feel frictionless. It should feel like, yes, it's technically overhead, but also I want to remember that I need to do this thing. So I'm going to put it in this little text box over here, or I'm going to put it on a sticky note or whatever it may be. And then I'm not going to forget about it later, and the system's just going to work. So now that I have taken that thought that I need to do something and put it on a piece of paper, or put it in a text box on a web app, or whatever it may be, I no longer have to worry about that thing. It's out of my head. And so now the system is going to do its job and remind me to do that at a later time when I can actually do it. So, with that said, constrained, not tyrannical. So this is an interesting one. Avoiding the planning trap. It is incredibly easy to get really motivated and have a sudden burst of motivation to actually do something. And then, we've all had this experience where it's like 1 a.m. or something like that, and it's the night before a big test, or you have school the next day or whatever it may be, and you get this burst of productivity. Okay, I'm going to get my life together. I'm going to start doing all my homework. I'm going to do 100 push-ups a night. I'm going to go in tomorrow. I'm going to start doing all my homework. I'm going to do all the homework that I currently have. I'm going to take that in, and you know what? You kind of ride this high or this wave of like motivation for like a whole week or something, and then all of a sudden it's just gone and you're back to where you were before. It's this weird phenomenon where you can get a lot of that dopaminergic like feeling of I actually accomplished something just by telling somebody the idea or just by making the plan in the first place. So making the plan feels productive. Thinking to yourself that you're going to be more productive feels productive. Telling somebody about your plan or telling somebody about your idea feels productive. It feels good. It feels like you actually accomplished something. But the problem is you didn't actually accomplish anything. And even if you did accomplish something, that's great, but that excitement wears off, and eventually with that high that you experience, you're going to come down, you're going to crash. And with that crash, it's going to be really, really hard to keep going. But that's where it actually matters, because if you can keep going after the crash, then you can actually accomplish the thing. It's fine to be excited, just to be extremely clear. Being excited isn't the problem. The problem is getting excited and then not actually following through with what you said you were going to do, because you already got the dopamine hit. It already felt great. And so now you don't really have the motivation to keep going, because why would you? Nobody really, I mean, a lot of the times it's like, nobody really cares if I actually do this or not, except for me. So a lot of it is like self-driven motivation. But a lot of the times it's also like, I kind of got started with it. It was really exciting. And now here's a new exciting thing. So I'm going to, chase that instead, or make a plan. So I don't know if that made a ton of sense, but the idea overall is that planning something alone can feel really exciting, and you want to avoid feeling that excitement and then thinking that you don't still have to do a bunch of work to actually accomplish that. This is also why I had a problem with goals for a long time, because it's one thing to set a goal, it's another thing to actually accomplish a goal. And so this is where building habits is really important, because you can set a goal, and that's kind of your plan, and then you say, okay, I have a goal to do X by Y, and so I'm going to do X thing by Y date. But then what happens is you kind of start to approach Y date, and you've kind of worked on X a couple of times, but you don't necessarily need to work on it now. Basically, you start procrastinating because there are better things to do in the meantime. Or maybe you don't, because you're a responsible human being. And then you get to that end goal, and maybe then your procrastination comes to life because you actually finished the thing that you were hoping to do. But a lot of the times, maybe you start working on the thing that you were supposed to do a week before, typical procrastination fashion, or the night before, if you're a true master procrastinator, or, just before you get to the deadline. And then you get like 50% through, or you get 30% through, or whatever it may be, and then you realize, oh, I didn't actually give myself enough time. Whatever it may be, you don't end up accomplishing your goal because the excitement wore off. You had a bunch of motivation when you made the goal, but then you didn't actually take the time to do it. Or you just don't feel motivated to do it at all. So that's why building habits is extremely useful, because instead of saying, I want to have X done by Y, you can say, I want to do X for Z amount of time every day. So I want to spend, 10 minutes a day working on my project. Or another way to do it is like, if you are a developer and you're working on a software of some kind, or like, a web app or something like that, and you want to get it done by a certain time, or you just want to get it done generally, one thing you can do is just like one line of code a day. So every single day you have to write at least one productive line of code. It's not that hard to do. This is a tip that I got from another YouTube video a while back, and I found it extremely useful. Basically, you need to add one productive line of code a day. If you do that, then you're good. And a lot of the times what you'll see is like maybe sometimes you write that one productive line of code and then you leave. You don't have anything else to do. But sometimes, and a lot of the time I find, you write that one productive line of code and then the ball's rolling. And now you start to think, okay, well, maybe now that I did that, I should do this, etc., etc. And then you're in the groove, and then you get into the flow, and now you've built a new feature of your project because you did one line of code. And then if you can do that every day, then that compounds really fast, and then you'll find that you fly through the deadline because you don't need the deadline because you built a habit to do it. And so that's why, deadlines are really great. But they can really hurt you because of the whole planning trap. And so building habits and building routines and really getting yourself to do repeated actions that compound towards your goal can be a lot more productive. And it can be a lot easier to tell yourself, okay, I need to do this one thing every single day, and then keep yourself consistent on that, than it is to say, I want to do this every week, or I want to do X by Y date. So yeah, a little bit of a tangent there, but avoid the planning trap because it can really, really hurt you in the long run in terms of productivity, because it can be the downfall of entire projects and you can waste months on it. Another key principle, and the last key principle, is decentralization. Decentralization is a concept that I've been thinking of recently because I've always had, I don't want to say always, but ever since I watched Iron Man, I had this idea of a Jarvis system. I could say, hey Jarvis, do this thing for me. Hey Jarvis, help me with this part of my business. I could be like Iron Man. I thought that idea was awesome. Or it could anticipate my needs, and it would be this AI entity that was as intelligent as any human being, or at least was as capable of executing certain functions as any human being or any human assistant, and even better because it was a system that could integrate with all of the technology that I would have around. I really, really liked that idea, and to a degree I still like that idea. But the problem is, for one, AI isn't good enough to actually be a single entity yet. We just don't have systems that are capable of thinking in a unified way at the level of a human assistant or a human secretary or a human worker or whatever it may be. And, there are whole debates over this, but it's just kind of like when you actually think about it, it's pretty obvious. I mean, one, language models, for example, which is what everybody thinks about when they think AI. They think ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever it may be. They can only think in text. So they might be able to think, and they probably aren't because they're just approximation machines and we're not. They can only do it in a single medium. Some of them can take in input, we can generate video, okay, we can do all sorts of different things. These things can't actually be motorized, they don't have limbs, they don't have arms, they can't control robots necessarily, and obviously all of these things that I'm saying, everybody's going to be able to refute in some way or another, but my point is that we don't have a single system which you would say, hey, which you would hire as a part of your business. And that's kind of what I'm saying here. Or as the CEO of your business, for that matter. We don't have a single system that could even take an employee's job at any skilled white-collar position as far as I'm concerned. But for that matter, we don't have something as cool as Jarvis, which could conduct your entire business and run everything because it's just this awesome, super intelligent AI. Maybe we'll have that at some point. Currently, we don't. It's just not good enough. And so, one, you shouldn't rely on AI to be that entity for you because it's not going to be able to handle that level of complexity. But additionally, it comes down to this idea that there are just so many different things that it would have to interact with that it kind of becomes pointless when you realize that most of these different applications have APIs, and they can actually just be connected to each other. Maybe you want to use Google Calendar and you also want to use Trello. You don't want to have two different applications. You don't want to have a single application that does everything. You want to have all of these different applications which manage different parts of your life, and you want to be able to connect them together. You want to be able to build the infrastructure between them, the roads and the bridges. And so this is the idea where you actually take all of the applications, all of the chaos between everything that you do, and you build something that can work with all of them, but because it kind of molds all of them together, and it kind of makes all of them work how you want them to work. So this is an extremely broad This has extremely broad implications because of just the sheer amount of things that can technically affect your mindset and your productivity and your attention and whatever it may be. But essentially, you don't want to build just one entity that is constantly tasked with managing everything about your life. You want to build systems that work towards your benefit, but also aren't just one single... I guess I'm not necessarily explaining this right. Let's take a practical example. I want a daily digest in my email every morning. So I have an automation that goes through and it checks Hacker News, and it checks the current weather, and it checks a bunch of other random things, and it compiles those into one report, and then it sends that to me, not an email actually, it sends it to me in Discord. So I built that because I thought that it would be nice to have a daily briefing. That doesn't mean that any single one of those entities is the central productivity platform. It's decentralized. And that's because that centralization should be you. You are the centralization. And the reason for that is, multifaceted as we've gone over, but you should think of yourself as we talked about with the discipline part, you are the foundation of your productivity system, and so you can think of yourself as the centralized entity. Another point in this is that projects, for example, aren't actually explicitly built out in at least the system that I'm building. They might be something that you want to build in your productivity system, but frankly, for the way that I think of it, every project that you start is probably best managed by a different software. Meaning, like, if I'm starting a new web app, I'm going to start that project in GitHub, and I'm going to manage everything in GitHub. But if I'm starting a new carpentry project or construction project, that's going to be way different. I'm going to have graph paper, I'm going to talk to different family members and things, and so the project management is going to be much different. I might use Google Docs, etc., etc. So projects are one of those things that has to be decentralized, just because you don't want to be stuck building a single app that can handle any individual type of project, because projects are so different in the way that in their actual nature. So yeah, think about yourself as the centralization. Don't try to build something that can sit between you and everything. Just try to build the roads and bridges between everything. With that said, now that we've gone over the key principles of productivity, now we can talk about the components of productivity, the different shapes and patterns that end up playing out in a productivity system. Now, this is pretty useful because these are the actual things that you end up building as data structures in whatever app that you end up building, or just series of bash scripts that you end up building, or sticky notes that you end up building, or color coding and such. This is where you're actually tracking stuff and actually taking individual patterns and building them out into your system. So we'll start with some of the biggest ones. One is other people. And now, this isn't something that you're going to be able to control, frankly. So, maybe you can, in which case there are a lot of questions to be asked about that. But essentially, other people are a huge influence on your productivity. This could be, your coworker asking for a meeting when maybe you don't need to have a meeting. This could have been an email. This could be your wife needs you to do something and it's urgent, so now you're being pulled away from what you were trying to do, but obviously you're going to take that priority. This could be any number of things. This could be people doing favors for you. Hey, can you do this thing for me? And then they go out and do it, and it makes your life easier. So now you can be more productive. So think of that. Other people are a huge influence on your productivity. And also remember that you are a sum of your influences. So we talked about the idea that you are the foundation for your productivity system. You are the centralization. Well, you are the sum of your influences. So you have all of these different people around you who are influencing you and who are affecting your behavior by influencing where you spend your time, how you think about things, the different ideas that you contend with, the type of information that you consume, the type of food that you consume, etc., etc. You are the sum of your influences, so those other people are going to affect you. So if you want to be productive, but you're surrounded by lazy people that don't eat healthy and maybe you don't like their views or things like that, maybe that isn't actually productive. Maybe you should think about changing your environment. But if you are, living in an environment where you're surrounded by people who are always on the move, who have ambitious ideas, who are very productive and spend their time actually doing things and eat healthy and exercise and do things that are bringing them towards their goals, then that's going to significantly affect your productivity. Second component of productivity is you, which we already kind of talked about, so I don't want to get too far into it, but because we mentioned food, and we mentioned mental, and we mentioned a little bit of spirituality and religion earlier, just remember that you are your body and your mind and your soul, and frankly, you have to take care of yourself or your productivity system is going to fail because, again, you are the foundation to it. Second, you are what you eat. And when I say this, I'm not just talking about food, because obviously food is important, but it's also information. It's also those influences that we talked about earlier. What you take in is what you are composed of. So if you take in a bunch of junk information, then you're going to be composed of junk information. And you can imagine that your mind is going to be composed of junk information. If you take in junk food, you're going to be composed of junk, and you might not, have proper resources to actually perform the functions that your body wants to perform, etc., etc. So just keep that in mind because it is important for you to be the foundation of your own productivity system. Additionally, you are an agent in an arena. So think of this as this is a game theory principle where essentially you are a player in a game and you are an agent in an arena, meaning that you are an entity which has agency, which acts in an arena, which is an environment of some kind with certain criteria, certain situations that you find yourself in. You're kind of like a character in a book. So this is just a mindset that can, a mental framework that you can use to understand how you move through life and move towards your goals and how you can be diverted towards your goals, and maybe that's okay. Think of yourself as an agent in an arena, and then you can start to take a little bit of a step back and zoom out and see the different resources available to you, see the different people available to you, different other players in the game, see different ways to approach a situation that maybe you didn't think of before. So, yeah. Now, let's get to some things that are a little bit more practical and tangible. One is prioritization. Prioritization is perhaps, after you yourself, the most fundamental aspect of productivity in and of itself. And that is a very big thing to say. But frankly, prioritization is one of the most fundamental things that you actually do. And that means a lot of things. One of the things it means is that it's the root of all your decisions. Everything that you do is based on prioritization. The fact that I am recording this video right now instead of eating ice cream, which I would love to be doing, is because of prioritization, because I figured that if I have this done, then I won't feel guilty when I eat my ice cream. So I'm going to feel a lot better about myself if I do that. And, that's maybe not the best example of a priority, but it did guide my decision to record this video now. Prioritization roots all of your decisions because ultimately you have different things that are meaningful to you. Prioritization is derived from that meaning. whatever is going to be most meaningful to you is going to be your top priority. So at the basis of every decision, you are considering what is meaningful to me, what is the most meaningful to me, and how does this decision affect that? And then that teeter-totters you in a certain direction. So think of yourself as a prioritization machine. You're constantly prioritizing everything. Even your vision is prioritizing things. The fact that you're looking at the screen right now, which I'm sure you are, but maybe you're not. If you're looking at the screen, then your vision itself, your eyeballs, your brain is prioritizing the information on this screen over what is behind you or what is, to your left, whatever it may be. You are prioritizing things in real time always. And so that kind of gets to the part about being explicit or implicit, is that, you aren't explicitly writing down that you are going to look at the screen at this very moment. Rather, your brain is doing it implicitly because you just kind of do prioritization all the way down. So think of prioritization as the sort of you are the foundation, you in and of yourself, but your priorities are going to affect everything from goals to the tasks that you work on to the things you get distracted by to the things that you don't get distracted by, etc., etc. So think of prioritization as a very deeply rooted thing that's very important. Next, we're going to talk about routine and habit, because after prioritization, routine and habits are another foundation to things like goals and tasks. The reason for this is because these are also derived from priorities. The habits and your routine that you have are going to be derived from priorities. But let's talk more about how habits and routines actually work together. Habits are the foundation of routine. If you think about literally everything that you do in a week, just take everything that you have done in the past week, lay it out on a timeline. You don't have to actually do this, but you'll notice patterns. You'll notice every single day I brush my teeth. That is a habit. That is a foundation of a routine, because if you get up in the morning and 95% of the time you start your day, one of the first thing, if not the first thing that you do is brush your teeth, that is part of the foundation of your routine. That gets different patterns started. When you brush your teeth, then your brain thinks, okay, I just brushed my teeth, check that off the list. What's the next thing that I do? And the reason for this is a little bit complicated, but essentially and maybe it isn't, but essentially it comes down to this idea that as you repeat actions or as patterns of behavior become more familiar to your brain, they sort of concretize, they crystallize, and they become more mechanical. And so you essentially build up these little machines, which we call habits, or which we call complexes, and you build up these little machines that guide your behavior in the future. That way you don't have to devote as many resources to decision making or to taking procedural action, etc., etc. That's kind of what muscle memory is, actually. So habits are the foundation of routine, and your habits are largely done unconsciously. With that said, these also just make up a large percentage of our time, because while habits are the foundation of routine, and you can pretty much think of like a very large percentage of what you do as simply being habits, there's also conscious decision, and you do a lot of things that are not purely habitual, and these kind of exist in dance. And so what this means is, when I was in like the 5th grade, I didn't brush my teeth. It wasn't a habit that I had. But when I got into middle school, I started to get self-conscious about that, which is a good thing. And then I decided to make the conscious decision to start brushing my teeth every day. So I built up that habit, and I actually decided that I was going to brush my teeth every morning before I went to school. And so I built up that habit. So now that's a habit of mine, but it didn't used to be. And now whenever I am brushing my teeth, then I start to think, okay, well, I brushed my teeth. What should I do after this? And the brushing of my teeth itself can kind of become an anchor point to what my next decisions are going to be, and my conscious decisions. Because, okay, so I'm brushing my teeth, so now I have this minty taste in my mouth. There was a banana that I was going to eat for breakfast, or an orange, but now I don't want to do that because this minty taste in my mouth is going to make that banana or that orange taste gross. So now my next conscious decision is going to be to drink water before I eat that banana. Whatever it may be, there is this dance between your habits and your conscious decisions, because your conscious decisions can help you form new habits, but then those old habits, which are the result of conscious decisions, are going to affect new conscious decisions. So it's important to consider this dance just because it kind of is going to build up your routine over time, and then your routine is going to kind of affect what you actually end up doing. Routine is the foundation to action, and because routine is so fundamental to the different things that you do throughout your day, it's going to have a lot of downstream effects as well. Routine is the foundation to action in the sense that you might go to work on a set schedule, or you might go to work on a not set schedule, but whatever it may be. I get up every Monday through Friday and I work from 9 to 5. So routine, that is my routine, that's part of my routine. Those are habits because I like having a job and I don't want to get fired. Routine becomes the foundation to action because I am at work from 9 to 5 on Mondays through Fridays, so the types of actions that I even perform are constrained by that routine. So the routine itself is incredibly important when you're thinking about how you're going to set goals, how you're going to do tasks, because if you have a routine that isn't conducive to actually getting things done, if you have a routine that is full of bad habits, then it's going to make it very, very difficult to actually get things done. So yeah, routine and habits are a central component to productivity. Focus is another central component because this is kind of like where you're directing the rocket nozzle. If you actually want to, take the rocket towards success, then you got to point the nozzle towards the right thing so that it propels you in that direction. I don't know if that analogy really works, but essentially, I mean, maybe you can think of it like a fire hose instead. Whatever the case, your focus is the nozzle for attention and energy. Right now I'm putting focus into recording this video. In fact, my eyes are currently trained on the word attention. That is every single part of my consciousness, maybe not every single part, but a large percentage of my consciousness dedicating itself to that particular word and understanding the idea of that particular word. And so essentially what focus lets you do is it takes all of this mental energy and directs it in a certain place. And then you can focus your energy on that place to actually get work done. So focus is the nozzle for attention and energy, which actually gets work done. Again, this is directed by prioritization. We talked about this earlier when we talked about prioritization, because we talked about how the fact that you're even watching this video and presumably your eyes are on this video right now is directed by prioritization. But if you think of this relationship between focus and prioritization, and then we think of like things like routine, habits are largely built by focus is largely built by prioritization, etc., etc. You see why focus is incredibly important, habits are incredibly important, and routine is incredibly important, is that eventually decides what gets work done. And all of these different systems play onto each other, and they all affect each other in real time. Next, we have goals. Goals we already kind of talked about earlier in the keys of success part, but essentially goals are the overarching targets that you want to hit. If you're playing soccer, you are trying to get a ball into a literal goal. And it's the same in pretty much all the other sports because they all have some sort of goal that you want to hit. Even if you're running track or something like that. I mean, the goal's the finish line. but the goal is also to beat your own record. And so there are these different goals which essentially set some measurable criteria by which success will be measured by said criteria, and then you will be happy that you completed that goal, and it will bring meaning to your life. So we already talked about SMART. It's probably worth mentioning it again just because specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound are important concepts to get down, but believe it or not, we're actually going to talk about this again later. So, yeah. Goals are once again determined by your priorities, because you aren't going to come up with goals that are irrelevant to the things that you actually find meaningful. Now, you may, but more likely than not, you're not going to, because they aren't going to matter to you. Or maybe they'll matter for like a split second while your attention and your interest is captivated, but eventually you're going to get over that, and then you're going to be like, why did I even set that goal? I don't care about that thing. So your goals are largely determined by your priorities. Your highest goals are going to be determined by your highest priorities. For example, one of my highest priorities is to be financially independent and be able to raise my family and take care of my whole family without relying on somebody else to make top-level decisions. I mean, maybe that isn't the right way to say it, but essentially I would like to be financially independent to the degree that you can technically be financially dependent. And so that is a goal of mine. That is a priority of mine. Because my priority is to take care of my family, and my priority is my family and the well-being of my family. So it's essentially determined by that, and that's one of my highest goals. So a lot of different goals, a lot of different sub-goals are going to be decided by that prioritization in and of itself. I want to start a business at some point. I want to start a successful startup or launch a product that ends up making money because it actually helps people. That is a sub-goal because it is a sub-priority to that higher priority. So again, this sort of hierarchy of priorities. With that said, we also can think of goals as consciously decided, because while your priorities are extremely influential on your goals, one, you can still come up with goals that are not within your priorities, but also you can think of priorities in and of themselves as consciously determined. So you do have power over your priorities, which, as we've seen, are pretty much foundational to everything else. But they're also consciously decided, but they're also kind of implicitly decided. So, this is actually a whole debate in and of itself, but essentially, goals are determined by your priorities. You should have them be SMART, and they're overarching targets that you want to hit. Tasks. Tasks are those kind of to-dos that you still need to do, and they don't necessarily need to be they don't necessarily need to be attached to a specific project or goal or anything in particular, but they are individual units of work. So maybe you spent some time, for whatever reason, throughout the day, looking into this idea of a garden that you want to build in your backyard. You want to build a garden, you want to know how to do it, so you'd spend some time researching that. Maybe that was a task. Now, it might not have been in pursuit of a particular goal. In that case, it might have been because it was a garden. But let's just say that was a hypothetical garden. Someday you want to build a garden, but you don't really care right now. Your interest just took you in that direction. So then you decided to take some time researching how to build a garden. Well, that was an individual unit of work. So it's important to think of tasks as implicit or explicit. You can actually define them, or they're just kind of happen in and of themselves. With that said, these are also things that are important to have specifically outlined and well defined. Not necessarily to the same degree as goals, I wouldn't say, but you should have a pretty good idea of when the task isn't complete and when it is complete, and what the task actually is. So, yeah. Tasks are fairly straightforward. We've all interacted with them. They can be attached to goals. You can have a goal of building a garden. I want to build a garden by let's say May. I want to build a garden by May 1st. By May 1st, I want to have my garden built. Okay, there's a goal. Now I can attach a task to it, or I can attach many different tasks to it in order to actually get to that point. So, yeah. And then goals are obviously dictated by priorities. So are tasks in a direct relationship, as well as habits. Because if you think of brushing your teeth as an individual unit of work, then excuse me, then that's dictated by your habits and your routine. So, yeah, something to think about. Next, we have projects. Again, we're not going to be talking about tracking projects specifically, but projects are essentially the products of work. Because if you think of a web app as a project, then a web app is a product of work, meaning those individual units of work that we talked about before, tasks, those are going to build up into projects. So that could be a garden, or it could be a web app. These are containers of requirements, meaning you have an outline of what needs to be achieved in order for a project to be considered complete. And so that project contains all of these different requirements, and once those are all checked off, then they're complete. And maybe you can think of each of those requirements as tasks as well. But yeah, tasks and goals can both contribute to projects. So maybe you have a goal of getting, phase 1 of your garden up by May, but that doesn't mean the entire thing is going to be complete. And then you have your tasks that make up your goal, but then they also make up your project. So these concepts all kind of play with each other, but you can think of a project pretty specifically as a product of work. Next, we have feedback and flexibility. So this is just kind of one of those components of a productivity system that is more meta. You have to take a step back and think of the productivity system as a whole. But essentially, you have to be refining your system based on practical insights. And this is a practice in taking a step back, like I mentioned, because you need to think of your productivity system as just kind of what your routine will actually be, the things that you will interact with, the time that you will actually spend, and the information that you will see. So if that isn't conducive to actually getting things done, then you need to change it. So you need to see, is this actually working for me? Am I getting the things done that I actually want to get done? Am I noticing friction? Am I noticing myself slipping up on different parts of the productivity system? Is that good, or is it bad, or is it unnecessary to have that part? Take a step back, think about how things are actually going practically, and then don't be afraid to refine your system. Just balance that with the fact that you will have some onboarding, and so you will need to figure out your system and get used to it before you're going to see real results. And so sometimes you can make changes way too early on when you didn't necessarily need to do that, but it just made it a little bit easier. And maybe that's a good thing, but oftentimes that can be bad. So just be aware of that. It is a balance. So now that we've gone over a brief outline of a productivity system's key components and principles, I'd like to take a further second to answer the question, what does a productivity system do? This is of course important because if you don't know what a productivity system does, then you're probably going to have a difficult time successfully building one. So, with that said, let's build for an example. This is you. You have a goal, like I want to have a working MVP for my app by June of 2025. Now, there isn't anything inherently wrong with this goal. It's not a terrible goal, but the problem is that it isn't necessarily as clear as it could be, and it's hard to derive things from this. If our productivity system is supposed to infer our needs and be able to derive from what we give it different actions that it can take, different information that it can categorize, and overall be capable of elevating us and being a platform for us to do work off of, then we need to have a more clear and solid foundation for it to work on. And so what do I mean by that? Well, practically speaking, goals are the foundation for a productivity system. And this is because they are the anchor points by which the productivity system can hook onto and orient you to. So, we talked about SMART goals earlier. And where SMART goals come into this is that they really allow you to flesh out a goal and make it a lot more useful. So, what does that look like in practice? Well, we have a goal here. I want to have a working MVP for my app by June of 2025. We've talked about this already, what the different components of a SMART goal are, but let's look at this example a bit more in depth and in practice. So for this particular goal, in order to make it more specific, we might add characteristics like what exactly is the name of the app and what are the different requirements that the app has. This allows us to really understand what it looks like to be working towards this goal because the different aspects of the goal are clearly defined. Next is measurable. We want to have measurable criteria by which this goal would be considered complete. For example, when the MVP has at least 3 non-family users who love it. Additionally, we might take time to define how progress will be tracked. Of course, here it's a little bit vague, saying progress will be tracked via a weekly meeting of co-founders, but that is still something. And it's important because it allows us to say that this is how we're going to actually track progress towards the completion criteria. Next is achievable. We want to outline how exactly we will achieve this, for example, by dedicating 10 hours per week to design and development, as well as what other components and dependencies we might need in order to make this possible. Maybe we need a designer to work on UI and UX for prototypes. Next is relevant. Relevance is determined by how relevant this particular goal is to another goal, or prioritizations that are more deeply held. Essentially, this keeps you from creating goals that are completely tangential to what you actually want to achieve in life, because although goals in and of themselves are pretty useful, if they're going off in the wrong direction, then you are getting off on the wrong foot altogether. So, the goal of determining relevance is to connect this goal back to something that is more deeply held, and this allows you to be successful more broadly. Next is time-bound, and this is fairly straightforward and actually implicitly defined by our initial goal. In this case, we just want to outline when this goal should be done, for example, June 1st of 2025. However, if we wanted to add even more detail to this, which might be very helpful, we could do a similar thing as we did in measurable and say that we are going to have a weekly meeting and outline what exactly that weekly meeting will be. That way, we're creating habits as well as deadlines. As we talked about earlier, habits can be extremely powerful in achieving deadlines, and deadlines in and of themselves can lead to procrastination and ultimately a failed project. So, we built goals, but there is still a central problem, and that problem is what we talked about before. We can build as many goals as we want, but that shiny fun task is going to lure us in the opposite direction, and then our focus and our attention and our work and our productivity isn't going to be aligned with our goals. We're not getting things done, we're not being productive. So, the ideal solution is to somehow take that shiny fun task and point it in the right direction, towards our goals. That way, the thing that we want to do, the thing that is interesting to us, the thing that is captivating and is trying to distract us is still going in the right direction of accomplishing something that we actually care about. With that said, how do we actually find the alignment? How do we find that shiny object? And then how do we align it with our goals? The simple solution is to create our own shiny object. So, how do we do this? Let's start with this question, which appears all the time in practice. What should I be working on? This is something that I ask myself over and over and over again when I am trying to work on something because I'm feeling motivated and I'm feeling like I should be productive and I'm feeling like I shouldn't just be sitting and being lazy. But then I ask myself this question because I don't have clearly defined goals or priorities or a clearly defined productivity system that can give me those shiny objects on demand. So, the goal of creating those shiny objects on demand is to answer this question, but how do we answer this question a little bit more specifically? Well, first of all, context matters. What should you be working on right now? Well, it probably has to do with where you're at and what your obligations are. So, for example, if you're like me, you probably have multiple different contexts that you could find yourself in. Work, where you work on maybe some apps if you're a developer like I am, and maybe you're working on an automation script there or something like that. Or maybe you're at home and you are doing some gardening or working on a smart home. Or maybe you have a side hustle and you're working on your startup. Whatever it may be, you have these different contexts that you appear in, and the context heavily constrains what you should be working on at a given time. Another way to constrain what you should be working on is to use something like an Eisenhower matrix to filter the different tasks and to-dos that you have into buckets. For example, the Eisenhower matrix works like this. You divide things on two different criteria. Is it urgent and is it important? If you have something that is neither urgent nor important, delete it. You don't need to do that thing. If you have something which is not urgent, but it is important, then you should schedule it. You can do that later on because it's not urgent, but you do need to do it. Next, if you have something which is urgent but ultimately unimportant, then it should probably get done, but it doesn't necessarily need to be done by you. Therefore, you can delegate that task. And finally, if you have something which is both urgent and important, then you should do that thing. That falls into the bucket of immediately due. Now, in a more complex system of interconnected parts like this one, you would take this matrix and use it in conjunction with others. So, for example, here, you could take all of the different due tasks and then bring them down to something like this. Now, that said, I would actually consider this different method of determining prioritization as a complementary to the Eisenhower matrix. So, in this little thing that I made, this is an interest-based prioritization, which is based on implicit interests, including urgency, as well as finding the things that you should do and aligning them with your goals. This allows us to get a little bit more complex than the Eisenhower matrix because the Eisenhower matrix doesn't account for the goals that we have set up through the course of our productivity system and through the course of our work. So, this wider bubble here is all of the things that you could possibly be doing. This includes things that you probably don't need to dedicate any time to at all. It includes the things that it pretty much includes an infinite amount of things because there are an infinite amount of things that you could be doing. However, within this greater set of things you could be doing, there are 3 different bubbles. So, first, there are the things that you need to do. The things that you need to do are those things which are basically an emergency, and if you don't do them, then something bad is going to happen. Now, that can be determined by any number of subjective criteria, but imagine this essentially as the do section up here in the Eisenhower matrix. It's both urgent and important. Do those things first. Pretty simple. The things that you need to do first are the urgent things. Once you've gotten past that particular subset, though, then you can focus on these other 2 bubbles, which are a little bit more interesting. So, first, we have the things that you should do. The things that you should do are determined by your goals. These are the things which do point you in the direction of completing your goals. So, based on your goals, the system can generate things like whatever it may be. Like maybe you have to write a line of code, or maybe you have to add a new feature for your MVP. That could be in the bucket of things that you should do. But there's another bucket, and that bucket is the things that you want to do. That's determined by any number of influences, including interest, and including the shininess of the particular thing. And those things that you want to do often include things that you shouldn't do, or rather things that don't necessarily bring you towards your goals. So, with that said, there is a sweet spot in between the things that you should do and the things that you want to do. That sweet spot is key. There is probably something that exists in between where your interest is and what you really want to be doing in a given moment and what you ideally would be doing if you were trying to pursue your goals. And if you can find that sweet spot and you can find things which within that sweet spot, then you're setting yourself up for success because your brain is going to do most of the work, and it doesn't have to do that much work to convince you to actually start doing a task that you not only feel like you should do, but you also want to do. So, eye that sweet spot. With that said, here's my beautiful drawing of the buckets of motivation, where you essentially want to fill each bucket before proceeding on to the next, and the flow of water here represents motivation. If you have things that you need to do, you should do those first. Use the motivation that you have to complete the things that you absolutely need to do, because those are like the burner with a pot of rice that's boiling over on the stove. You really need to turn that off. And before you get to anything that maybe brings you towards longer term goals or that you want to do, you should really figure out the things that you need to do. With that said, if you have enough motivation and you start to overflow the bucket of things that you need to do, then you can move on to the things that you both should and want to do. That is the sweet spot that we talked about before. So, once you've done all of the things that you both should and want to do, then you can see whether or not you have enough motivation to do the things that you should do. Because there are going to be things that you don't necessarily want to do, but you ultimately should do because they bring you towards your goals. With that said, oftentimes once you have that ball rolling, once you have that inertia, then you can pretty easily get yourself to do things that are more peripheral, meaning that you can end up doing things that you should do just by starting with the things that you should and want to do. With that said, if you don't have enough motivation, then sometimes it's fine to just relax and do the things that you want to do. So here are some tips on how to get motivated, because motivation is incredibly important. We'll just take a second to talk about these. The first one is to think about something between the ideal and the easiest. So what that means is that you might have the absolute ideal action that you'd be doing at a given time. On the other hand, you have the easiest thing that you could be doing at a given time. And that's probably what you're currently doing, or the thing that you want to be doing instead of what you're currently doing. So, think about it this way. Let's say that you're sitting on the couch and you're playing video games and you're eating potato chips. That's the easiest thing that you could be doing in the near future. That's the easiest thing because not only do you have inertia, meaning that an object in motion will remain in motion unless acted upon by an opposing force, and an object at rest will remain at rest unless acted upon by an opposing force. You are an object at rest, and you're an object that is satisfied at rest because you're not hungry because you're eating your potato chips and they taste very good, and you're also very occupied and interested in the video game that you're playing. So that's the easiest thing that you could be doing. But let's say that you have this MVP idea. You want to build an MVP, and so you know that what you should be doing is working on that one feature that is just so critical to the success of your app. But maybe there's something in between those ideals. Because getting to the ideal thing that you should actually be doing would require getting the ball rolling. It would require getting that inertia going. And getting that inertia going takes a lot of force. But what takes a little bit less force is just kind of nudging the ball. If you can find something in between the ideal thing that you could be doing and the easiest thing that you can be doing, which is what you're currently doing, then you might be able to motivate yourself to eventually get to that ideal. So, what's a practical example of that? Well, let's say that you are sitting on the couch and you're eating your potato chips and you're playing video games. Well, maybe instead of playing video games, instead you start watching a YouTube video which is about the thing that you are trying to build a feature for. Now you are getting your mind interested in the whole thing. You're still eating potato chips and you're still sitting on the couch, and this is significantly easier than actually working on the feature. However, what it lets you do is move in the right direction. With that said, once you're going in the right direction, you can get the ball rolling. And getting the ball rolling is huge. This is the rationale behind the idea that we talked about earlier with writing one line of code a day. If you can write one line of code a day, or for some people with like actual writing, they do a paragraph a day or things like that, then oftentimes getting that ball rolling is the hardest step. Actually getting started is the hardest step. And then once you see some positive output of what you have dedicated some little bit of mental effort towards doing, then the ball is rolling and you find that further paragraphs or further lines of code are much easier. A fourth thing that you can work on is just aligning this task with what's important to you. So what does that mean? That essentially means that those goals that you have or those priorities that you have are still there and they're fundamental to you. They make up what is actually important to you and they're meaningful to you. If you can take the task that you know you should be doing and align it with that goal that is fundamental and important to you, then oftentimes you'll notice this resonance where you end up feeling that motivation to work towards what is fundamentally important to you and what is fundamentally meaningful to you, and you can find motivation that way. A fourth thing that is sort of a bonus tip is sometimes doing something harder than the ideal thing to be working on can work to get you motivated. And what I mean by that is that if you're sitting on the couch and you're eating potato chips and you're playing video games, and that's a very dopaminergic action. That's something that is extremely fun to do, and it's the easy thing to do, and inertia means that it's very hard to get to that ideal point. Well, let's say that you take a different route. Forget about the ideal and just do something else that is hard. Say you go take a cold shower. Well, now that you've taken that cold shower, that is a difficult thing to do, but it's in the opposite direction. It's completely tangential to the ideal thing that you should be working on. But now that you have done something hard, well, now it's a little bit easier to come back to that ideal thing that you'd be working on. And that actually becomes easier than the cold shower that you just took. So sometimes the easiest way to get the ball up the hill is to go up a harder part of the hill that is a little bit easier to get over. Maybe it's steeper, but a much shorter distance overall. And then once you're up there, then you can get to the part that you actually need to get to. With that said, between the prioritization and the context and the goals, you will find the shiny object that we need to generate. This works because it is the convergence between the side hustle and the prioritization and the goal where we find our interest and where we find where we should guide our focus and where we should be creating those shiny objects that we talked about before. So let's look at this in practice on paper. So we talked about this already. We created that SMART goal. So let's just assume that we have the SMART goal created. Let's just say I want to have the MVP for my app done by June of 2025. We create this into a SMART goal. So S. This is going to be specific now. I'm going to create the MVP for my productivity system by June of 2025. It will have the following requirements. 1, it will have a chat interface, and 2, it will be able to track goals, and lastly 3, it will be able to connect to-dos to goals. Don't pay too much attention to the specifics here, but this is essentially just the process that we're going through. M. I will know when it's done when I can tell my chatbot that I need to do something, and it will create a to-do in connection with an existing goal. Next, we have achievable. I will utilize my development knowledge to write this application from scratch, and I can integrate it with my private Discord bot. Relevant. This is relevant to my goal of achieving many things and becoming better at time management. And then time-bound. This will be done by June of 2025. I will post monthly updates. Now, I might not actually do the monthly updates, but that's essentially the outline. We have created our MVP and our MVP-based goal, and then we made it smart. So because we made it smart, we can now take that goal, and then for a given situation, we can try to answer this question: what should I be working on right now? Now, this is going to be one of many goals. So we'll assume that we aren't necessarily going to need, we aren't necessarily going to follow this exact example every single time, because there are going to be multiple different goals. But the way that this will work in practice is that when we ask this question, what should I be working on right now? The system evaluates 3 different criteria. First of all, what goals exist? That's where it's going to find the one that we just defined. MVP by June 2025. Next, what is the current context? Let's just say in this case that the context is at the desk working on Productivity Suite. Pretty straightforward. That aligns with our goals. In fact, instead of doing that, let's just say working on side projects. That way, it's still a little bit more vague, because you might want to create this MVP, but it's not the only thing that you're working on. If you're anything like me, you're getting tied into multiple different tangents, so it's not necessarily just the Productivity Suite that you'd be working on, it'd be any number of things. And then next, the third thing is going to be the prioritization question. Now, this is a little bit trickier to actually get down, but essentially, what is the user currently interested in? Now, this can be derived from many different sources, and it's a little bit tricky to say that it should be derived from any specific sources, because it's going to be entirely dependent on your current situation. But for me, oftentimes when I am sitting down and I have nothing to do, and my hands are free, they navigate me towards something like YouTube or Substack or any number of media source where I can start to consume some information. So, let's say, what was the last watched video on YouTube? So, with that said, now that we have these different questions answered by the actually, before we do that, we should actually answer this. Let's say the last watch video on YouTube by me, in this case, was how to optimize how to optimize focus, or something like that. So, I watched this video, how to optimize focus. The system knows that I have a goal to finish my productivity MVP by June of 2025. And on top of that, I'm currently sitting at my desk working on side projects. So that's the current context. So then, to answer this question, what should I be working on right now? All the system has to do is find something that converges all of these different things. It knows what my goal is. It knows that I'm working on side projects, and it also knows that I am currently interested on how to optimize focus. So maybe the system sends me a message like, "Hey Aiden, How do you plan to optimize your own focus through your productivity system? Now, it answers this question for me, or it asks this question to me, and now it's up to me to answer that question, which gets my mind moving in that direction. You can see how, based on that convergence of different contexts, including the context itself and the goals and the thing that the user is currently interested in, we can start to actually coerce the user, which is you, in the direction of their goals. That productivity MVP needs to be done by June of 2025. We know that. We know that the user currently has time to work on that. So they can work towards that goal. And on top of that, we know that they are wondering about optimization of focus. And so that kind of allows us to point them in the direction based on their current interest. It's not necessarily so hard to point them slightly in a different direction and then point their current interest in the direction of their long-term goal. Now, this is a pretty straightforward example, and in practice, it might look a little bit different, but this is essentially how you can expect this whole system to work. So, we looked at a practical example, but now let's look at this a little bit more technically and design the system to build shiny objects on demand. So, we talked about this already, the convergence of the context and the goals and the prioritization leading to that shiny object that we want to create. However, what we want to actually build is a system that sits in between all of those different areas and understands all of those things about us and then generates those shiny objects for us. We knew that it existed in that convergence, but now we need to make the system that actually converges those things and pops out a shiny object. So, let's talk about some general principles of the system that we're going to integrate. First, SMART goals are a top-level module. We already talked about this, how when we create a SMART goal, it allows us to build the foundation for our wider system. This is how that happens. The system itself has SMART goals well structured and entirely as a top-level module where other modules are going to depend on those SMART goals and anchor to them so that we can build features from that. We'll get into that a little bit more later. Next, the system needs to understand context, goals, and interests to align you towards your goals. And ultimately, it is about aligning you towards your goals, but that's what we just went through with that practical example. Next, it's going to provide a vehicle towards those shiny objects. The idea isn't for this to be this massive centralized platform, but the productivity system is this integrated system of parts where we have the road and then we have the vehicle that travels the road. So we're building the road and the vehicle. We're not building the buildings and the different plots of land and different landmarks that we might use in the general system because we don't need to. Those already exist. We want the vehicle that will take us in the right direction. And we'll explain more how that actually works. Next, I just want to review the constraints and principles that we talked about earlier in the key components section. First, mindset. We need to adapt the system to an individual's mindset, whether that be a growth mindset or a fixed mindset, or maybe it means getting out of the fixed mindset in the first place. Next, goals. We're anchoring to goals, and SMART goals specifically. Next, cognitive load. We need to decrease the cognitive load because that allows us to put more focus into less things, which means getting more work done in the things that are actually meaningful to us. Mindfulness. Encouraging presence of mind allows you to really think about how you think. And that reflectivity lets you refine your system over time and understand where its weaknesses are and understand where your own weaknesses are as well as your strengths so that you can put your best foot forward. Discipline is incredibly important here as well because ultimately your own discipline is going to play a primary role in your productivity. constraint in and of itself. Don't make the entire productivity system another task. It should be a platform for you to walk on, not an additional friction point that keeps you from your tasks. And then the planning trap. Avoid the cheap dopamine of simply planning something out and telling a bunch of people about it just to never think about it or never work towards it again. And lastly, we have decentralization. We're trying to build those adaptable roads. We don't need to build every single component of the productivity system. We just need to build the system that is in between. We need to build the roads from Google Tasks to GitHub Actions, for example. We need to build the roads between your Google Calendar and your email. Whatever it may be, we're trying to build the roads between different applications, and maybe there's some centralization there. You drive a car, that gets you places. That's the level of centralization that you want. So, the system needs to point the user in the direction of their goals. We already talked about how the system sort of is in between all of these different priorities and goals and contexts, but it actually has to manage all of these things, and it needs to understand how they all work, and it has to have these somehow stored as data. So, how do we create, manage, and leverage goals? How do we store these as data, and then how do we use them to create features? Well, I obviously didn't think this all the way through. This is not the right size. But whatever it may be, your goal is constructed of specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound criteria. And these can all be even columns in a database, however you want to structure it, if your goals meet these different criteria, and you can fill in these different fields for an individual goal, maybe based on a template or something like that. You can actually use this and create this as an entry in a database or something like that and create an entire system around these particular goals because they have structure to them. So, SMART goals can be broken down into their different components. For example, once we have those components, we can start creating features. Once we have the specificity of a specific goal, then we can start generating tasks based on those specific requirements. Like we talked about before with the MVP, once we know requirement 1, requirement 2, and requirement 3, those can be turned into tasks which are managed by the system. The measurability aspect. It can automatically track whether or not your goal is completed or not, or it can periodically measure the progress towards your goal. And the cool thing about the new age of technology and the things that have happened since the last maybe wave of productivity systems is that now we have reasoning engines which can actually look at these things a little bit more abstractly. We can really start to automate a lot of these things based on natural language alone. Achievable. We can schedule tasks based on achievability outline or interfaces with relevant apps. Once we outline how we're actually going to achieve this in practice, maybe we're using GitHub. And so we outline that because we're going to, utilize our development skills. Maybe in order to make this achievable, it starts compiling all of these different resources. Or it interfaces with GitHub to create a project for us and start putting tasks in there. Whatever it may be, the productivity system can use the achievability to understand specific context and then take action based on that. Next is relevant. Maybe it cross-references goals with long-term priorities and proposes potentially relevant new goals or flags irrelevant ones. When you go to create a goal, it says, listen, maybe this isn't actually very connected to your long-term goals. Maybe this isn't actually a relevant goal. Are you sure you want to put that in there? Are you sure that this is something that you actually will care about a week from now? Or it can be like, listen, I see all of these different goals that you have set, and I see a space between them. I see a way that these can be connected, and here's a new goal. What do you think of this goal? Is this something that you would want to make a goal? It can start to feel like a second brain or a subconscious. And then time-bound. This is fairly straightforward. It can schedule reminders for you, it can update your timeline, and notifications are a big thing where we have to balance them because we don't want to make ourselves, we don't want to fill our day with spam, and we don't want to be noisy, but we can actually have notifications of upcoming deadlines to hold us accountable. Next, context is incredibly important. So how does the system understand context, and how does it affect our flow? Well, the system might take in things like app activity or our calendar or prompts generally, like maybe we have webhooks or things like that, which tell the system what we're doing. Or maybe we just explicitly declare it. The system asks, what are you doing right now? And then we say, this is what we're doing. Here's our current context. It doesn't have to be complicated, but you can see the potential for automations in this area. Once you have all of these different things integrated with your system, or even some basic like NAN knowledge or other automation software, you can start to build these integrations where the system just knows what you're currently up to, and then that becomes an argument for later functions. So, based on your app activity or your calendar or your prompts, maybe your calendar says, hey, from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., we're going to work on the startup. And so it's between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., so the system knows you're working on your side hustle. Context can be declared or it can be derived. With that said, once we actually have that context, then we can start to really do some fancy stuff. Like, for example, we can create the filter that we were talking about earlier. Notifications can become extremely noisy. They can become a huge burden on your cognition and contribute to that cognitive load we talked about before. So in the spirit of minimizing that, say that you are at work, you only need notifications that are relevant to work. Now, that might not be entirely true. Maybe you still want to get emergency calls from family, or you still want to get calls and texts from family more generally. That's okay. You can integrate that however you want. But the idea here is that if you're at work, you should have your entire system curated towards your current context. That way, you can really filter out everything that isn't important and focus on what's important. So that goes for home as well. Once you're at home and you're working on the garden or smart home, you don't need anything from work, or the side hustle for that matter. Or maybe you do, and that's up to you. You can set the system up however you want. When you're working on the side hustle, maybe that's when it's time to get those notifications. Or you can even have apps filtered in the same way. Maybe you have specific apps that you use at work, but you don't use at home. Or you have specific apps that you use for your side hustle, but you don't use at work. Those kinds of things can also be filtered out. You don't need different apps open that aren't going to be relevant to your current context. So the context acts as a filter, and it can be a built-in constraint on the information that you're taking in. And once again, I apologize for having my slides cut off. Next, and potentially most complicated, is understanding prioritization and having that built into the system. What needs to get done, and what should I be doing right now? Those are the two big questions. So, what should I be doing right now? We talked about this before, the so-called Eisenhower matrix, but essentially we have these different quadrants, and we can think of in our system, in practice, the things in do being passed on to the next filter. So let's just say that we have this giant body of tasks, and we need to put them through a filter. This filter will allow us to, I want to see if I can actually, I can't do that unfortunately. I thought I could maybe zoom out a little bit because I did have bullet points here that are unfortunately getting cut off. But essentially we have these different quadrants, and if you imagine this as a sort of chain of filters to constrain your tasks over time, then first you have your urgent and important tasks, and those are the most important to the degree where those get passed on to the next filter. Nothing else needs to necessarily get passed on to the next filter, but what can happen is you can start to set up automations based on this. The things in do can be passed on to the next filter, but the things in delegate can be automated. If you start to see a task appear in the delegate category a few times, maybe it's time to write a script to do that for you instead. Or if you have things that are scheduled, you can just have your assistant or have your productivity system, for that matter, schedule that for you and create a task. The things in delete can just be voided entirely, and they can go into a junk folder, or maybe you have a someday maybe folder that has things that maybe you want to do at some point, but they aren't really that important, so you're not going to prioritize them. So now that we know what we should do, let's figure out how to get ourselves to do it in the first place. So the way that this generally works is that the things that you should do are going to be derived from a combination of your current context and a goal of some kind. So if you have goals that are tied to your current context, there's going to be tasks which are relevant to your current context and a goal. Those are the things that you should do at a given moment, because when you're at work, you should be working on things that are related to work, most likely. And if you have goals related to work, then assumedly there are things that you can be doing to work towards your goals for work specifically. And that's how you generate the things you should do category of tasks. But next, let's talk about what do I want to do right now? This is a big question because it's a little bit hard to actually gather this information accurately, especially in an automated sense. But once again, we were talking about how reasoning engines are available to us now. We have automated reasoning to a significant degree. It can automate our language, and therefore it can automate large swaths of our ability to reason. And so we can actually start to answer this question with a computer. So let's talk about what actually makes up your own interest. So interest makes up a large part of what you want to be doing at a given time, and interest is largely composed of a combination of factors including emotional relevance, complexity, novelty, and existing experience. It should resonate with you sort of emotionally. It should feel good to see that thing, or maybe it's something that you actually love. Maybe something that you love has relation to this thing. Or maybe it's something that you don't really like at all. Maybe you're really adverse to something, and then that makes some tangential thing to that an interesting thing. Whatever it may be, there should be some relevant emotion to a specific thing, and then that is going to be a contributing factor towards making it interesting. Next is complexity. The complexity of a given thing means that your mind can actually chew on it a little bit. And your mind needs to be able to chew on something for it to be interesting. Otherwise, your brain doesn't need to be interested in it because it's already understood that thing. Next is it needs to be novel. Novelty is a big part of interest, just broadly, but it essentially allows you to create things that are something that is new information, something that is potentially very useful to your mind, is going to be interesting to you, as long as it meets the other criteria to a significant enough degree as well. And then lastly, we have existing experience, which is this should be relevant in some way to your existing experience through life and through thinking about things or whatever it may be. Something that is interesting to you is probably going to be relevant to what you have done before or what you have cared about or been interested in before. With that said, other things influence what you want to do as well, not just interest. One thing is friends. You have lots of people who are texting you all the time, most likely, and that means that you're going to have people pulling you in different directions or suggesting different things or whatever it may be. Your friends are going to have a large influence on you. Energy levels matter as well. What exactly is your energy level at a current moment? Are you exhausted? Did you have a really long day and now you're ready to go to bed? If that's the case, you're probably not going to be interested in that much other than just going to bed. Additionally, we have mood. Mood is going to matter a lot towards how what you're going to be wanting to do at a given time. If you're really angry and huffing and puffing, then maybe you're not going to want to work on your startup idea because it's just not something that you're in the mood to do. Next, we have habits and routines. We talked earlier about how habits and routines are sort of the foundation to all of the actions that you take. And this is, of course, the case here as well. If it's time for you to brush your teeth, then you're probably going to brush your teeth over doing some other action. Maybe that's not the case, but oftentimes you're going to prioritize that. And then lastly, you have monetary incentives. There's probably a reason why you have the job that you have. You have an obligation to make money, and so because, or not even necessarily an obligation, but a desire to make money, and so you have an incentive to make that money by doing a good job, and so that is going to influence your actions. Additionally, there are monetary incentives towards creating your own business or whatever it may be. Money does influence what we want to be doing at a given time because money ends up being a really big motivating factor. So, between all of those sort of impulses, whether that be your friends or your energy levels or your habits and routines or monetary incentives or mood, and then your interests, which is driven by experience and emotion and novelty and complexity, you have the things that you want to do. You can see how this is going to be a lot more complicated to actually integrate into your system. And so, honestly, it might be best to just start by explicitly defining what you're interested in to your productivity system, or having some system to actually get that, to actually inform your system as to, what you're currently interested in doing. If you want it to automate prioritization or automate task selection, whatever it may be, this is going to be based on a lot of different influences, and so you can see how there's going to be complexity here. Nonetheless, it is actually doable, and you can start to see where your interest comes from, or where that question of what do I want to be doing right now can be answered. So, once you have that things that you want to do, those are the things that take little inertia, that take a little bit of force to get yourself to do. They don't take as much as the things that you should do necessarily. So, once again, we have those sweet spots. That sweet spot between the things that you should do, which is driven by your goals and your context, and the things that you want to do, which is driven by your interest and your impulses. That sweet spot is going to align you towards your goals and be easy to do. So, that's when you can just get things done. So now let's talk a little bit more directly about the tools that we're going to use, or that I'm going to use to pull this off. So we'll start with some of these mobile apps, and the reason for this is because the mobile phone is a significant part of the productivity system, and the reason for that is because your mobile phone is very prominent in your life, or at least it's prominent in mine, to the degree that a lot of my focus is given to the mobile phone, and therefore I would like to use it as a medium for my productivity system through a variety of different functionalities that the Android operating system as a whole, as well as specific apps, provide. So, first of all, the Google Pixel specifically, just what I have, but also most Androids have something like this, has a focus mode available, where essentially you can mark specific apps as distracting, and then once you have done that, once you go into focus mode, you will not see any notifications whatsoever from your distracting apps. Additionally, there is the digital well-being suite, which allows you to see and track your digital presence and how often and how much attention overall you are giving each individual app within your phone, as well as your phone as a whole, how much time you're spending in front of your phone screen. So I'm going to be utilizing those applications, which are part of the operating system itself, quite effectively, hopefully, to really understand myself better and reflect, as well as constrain the amount of cognitive load that I'm taking in, the amount of information that is coming my way. Second, and this is going to actually be a cross-platform thing, and maybe a little bit unorthodox, but I'm going to be using Discord for my productivity system. Now, I can't take all the credit for this. It was actually a friend of mine, Bilal, who really showed me how you can use and leverage Discord for information organization and then productivity more broadly. And I'd like to just take a second and actually show you what exactly I mean. So right here, I have a resource. This is a pretty interesting video I found earlier on how to make money by growing trees. And essentially, it's just a very interesting way to potentially profit off of having a little bit of land by growing tree starters. Now, I know that I want to have that video in the future, but I don't necessarily know what it will look like for me to have that. I don't necessarily know. I could put it into a playlist on YouTube, but that creates a bit of a silo for all my resources, and I'd like to have all of my resources neatly categorized in one location. So Discord has become that location. In fact, Discord is where I am keeping all of my resources, and the way that I'm doing it is with this little Discord bot that I made called Clementine that will take a given resource, like the one that I just showed you, and when I send it that message in my dump channel, it will attempt to send, it will look into that resource, and then it will attempt to sort it. And so what we should find is once it is done, it will mark that complete. It'll say that it sorted it. And then if I go over to farming and agriculture, here we are, we have that resource here. So that is a system that I've gotten set up. And another way that this works is I can send messages. As you can see here, I have a to-do from earlier. So I can create to-do lists, and essentially what Clementine is capable of doing is taking any message that I send whatsoever to the dump channel and sorting it into any other channel within the server. And so what that lets me do is just organize information very, very easily. I can just send a message to this one specific channel and it just works. It handles everything automatically. So this gets back to that idea that we were talking about earlier of the ability of modern systems to actually do automated reasoning. Now we'll focus on that a little bit more later, but that is how I'm leveraging Discord, and I'm leveraging that across platforms because obviously Discord is cross-platform. So I can access my Discord server from anywhere. There are a couple of downsides to it, like, for example, it's not offline, etc., but for the vast majority of resources, I can use Discord as a big dump of information and then also a way to organize information and then track things over time. And then you can integrate plenty of different applications with Discord, and I'll get into some of those later. But and then another thing that I'm using on mobile apps is Google Suite. Now, Google has a whole, they have a G Suite product. I'm not necessarily talking about that, but my point is that they have a huge suite of products from Google Calendar to Google Tasks, etc., which allow you to track different aspects of productivity and really manage your life and collaborate with others in intuitive ways. And so I'm leveraging Google Suite along with all of these other different applications to handle these things. For example, we talked about tasks earlier. Google has an entire tasks application that I can leverage, and that makes things extremely useful. That makes things extremely simple because then I can access that anywhere in any of my apps, and it also integrates with Google Calendar, and then I can use Gemini or other mobile assistants to interact with them. And then on top of that, you've got Calendar itself, which is helpful for establishing routines, and Google Docs can be used to integrate with other things. And basically, Google just has a really solid suite of products that can be used for productivity. Now, onto desktop apps, I already described how I'm using Discord. But another thing that I'm using is Arc Browser. Now, Arc Browser is a newer Chromium-based browser, which has a lot of interesting features, such as my favorite, is having all of your tabs over here on the left and being able to sort your different spaces, which have different tabs each. And so, for example, this is a space that I have, which just is for ideas and brainstorming. This one is for development, and I have other ones as well. And it essentially lets me really organize all of my information. And we talked about context earlier. this allows me to actually break my web browsing, which is a large percentage of what I end up working on throughout the day, is through a web browser. This allows me to shift my context and constrain my context to a specific space. And then it allows me to configure the different applications and the different resources and the different web pages that I have pulled up per space. So it's incredibly useful. Another thing that I have going on is called N8N. Now, N8N is and find it on GitHub, it is a fair code application for workflow automation. And it's called fair code because it's not entirely MIT licensed. From what I understand, it's not. It's got a permissive license, but it doesn't necessarily have a fully open source, as considered by Open Source Initiative, license, but it does have a license that allows you to pretty much just run this for free and self-host it, and that's really, really cool to me. So basically, I have my own instance of N8N up and running, and the way that I'm using this is, for example, in conjunction with Discord, I have my morning briefing flow. And so this allows me to do things like take my Google Calendar, take an RSS feed from Hacker News, and take the current open weather in my current location, combine these all, run it through a language model to get an AI summary, and then send that to a dedicated Discord channel. That Discord channel is my briefings channel, and if I go to my briefings channel, if I can find it, I swear I had it somewhere. Here we are. I get one of these every single day. Every morning, that N8N flow that I showed you runs on a routine and sends me an AI overview as well as calendar events and a weather summary, etc., etc. So it makes things incredibly useful, and I would really recommend checking out N8N for automation generally, because this thing has tons and tons of different features, and it has tons and tons of different integrations into applications. So with that said, I'm also using other project management tools, and we talked earlier about how projects specifically are not being tracked by our productivity system. And the reason for that is because projects vary incredibly. And a construction project isn't going to be well tracked by GitHub, but GitHub projects are going to be very useful for something like a web app or any other kind of software-based project. And so essentially, we're leaving project management to specific projects. There are specific there are more like generic project management tools, like Asana is one that is often used, or Trello is another one. But as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing is that you find the right project management software for the job and then integrate that into your system. So I mentioned I'm using GitHub for software development and software engineering type projects, but I'll probably just use a pen and paper or something like that for construction projects or gardening projects and such, because those kinds of things aren't going to be super necessary to have all integrated into a specific software and might be best represented on pen and paper. And so with that said, I'm using project management tools to manage those projects. Now, lastly, I have a couple of other tools that I'm using for developer-specific stuff, and the reason I bring up developer tools is because a large percentage of your productivity suite is going to be automations, and if you have some software development skills or any sort of engineering skills, you should be able to integrate and really expand and automate whatever you want to do. So Simple Agent is a project. We'll do a little shameless plug here. Simple Agent is a project that I have created as a template for an autonomous agent. So Simple Agent is capable of, you basically just clone the repository, and then you have a an agent up and running that you can customize to your heart's content. Think of it as a template repository. And so you can customize this agent and expose it to the outside world if you want, or other things like that. And then you can end up building a very capable autonomous agent with any tool integrations that you would like. And it's able to reason, as you can see on this demo, it's able to do multi-step reasoning and utilize those tools effectively to actually perform operations. And it uses a very simple mechanism to do this, very simple architecture, which is basically just, it has a perception that is the information it takes in. It reasons based on that information, and then it performs actions, and then that exists in a constant loop. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Simple Agent specifically, check out my video on Simple Agent. I will link it below. With that said, Simple Agent is just one of the tools that I plan on using to integrate with my productivity suite as a whole. There's other AI tooling as well. I already mentioned NAN. NAN has a lot of AI capabilities. It integrates with a platform, with a framework called LangChain, which in and of itself is a complex system that you can leverage to create flows of data through different language models and other models as well to create really complex chains of language transformation and reasoning. So this can be really helpful if you have very abstract automations that you want to put together. LangChain can help you do that. But NAN actually integrates with LangChain so that you can do it all in a low-code format as opposed to having to code everything out yourself. Another one that you might want to check out is called Flowwise. This is an open source project, an excellent open source project and it is so fun to use and very, very intuitive. Follows a very similar, I would say, way of doing things to NAN, but I do think that it is more intuitive in a lot of ways than NAN when it comes to building language model specific integrations. NAN is a very developer friendly, I would say, system. So if you're very interested in low code and simple integrations where everything is centered around just building LLM apps through a drag and drop interface, then maybe check out Flowwise as well and integrate that into your productivity system as well. So with that said, other things that I'm using are just basic bash scripts, which of course, and then browser automations like setting up extensions or Puppeteer or Playwright automations to go through and click buttons, etc., and automate certain interactions. We talked about earlier that Eisenhower matrix. When it comes to the delegate quadrant of the Eisenhower matrix, at least for me, let me see if I can just go find it. At least for me, I don't have subordinates that I can delegate tasks to. So the idea is to automate those tasks. And frankly, automation is getting easier and easier as we do have language engines and they do get smarter and smarter. So for those things that exist in the delegate section where they're urgent, they need to be done, but they aren't necessarily super important, or they come up again and again and they're recurring, it may be worth considering automating those tasks. And you can use things like bash scripts or browser automations or whatever it may be to do so. Now, with that said, those are all the different tools that I'm using. There will probably be others, and I will keep people updated on specific workflows that I'm doing. I want to make a video about a particular learning workflow that I'm using with Gemini's Deep Research and Notebook LM, for example, and there should be a video about that sometime in the future. But I'll keep you updated on the different tooling that I'm using and the different specific flows that I'm using alongside my Discord server as I continue building out this productivity system. But for now, that's a brief overview of the tools that I should expect to be using. With that said, I would like to introduce the concept of Clementine. I've mentioned Clementine before because it's the name of my Discord server as well as the app and Discord bot that I integrated into my Discord server. But the idea is that this is the sort of digital secretary. And I want to keep in mind the idea of decentralization, because I talked before about how AI just isn't there yet in terms of being a centralized entity that's just capable of taking initiative and anticipating needs and executing tasks very well and being extremely reliable. It just isn't there yet. It doesn't perform tasks very well when you have multi-step complex tasks. And it's probably going to be a while before it does that. A lot of people might sort of flame me for saying that, but I am fairly skeptical of language models, just having interacted with them for years at this point and used them daily. They fail a lot, and they're just not very good at common sense. So you're going to run into a lot of issues if you try to make too complex of workflows where you're making where you're where the decision tree expands too far. Too much complexity, and an agent is going to fly off the rails, get stuck in loops. It's going to fall in the pit of death where it just can't get past a certain step, and it's going to fail. It's going to cost you a bunch of money because you're paying for API calls, and nobody's going to be having a good time. So, with that said, there is an area where you can build these digital secretaries. I'm calling mine Clementine, and you can call yours whatever you'd like, but it relies on decentralization, because Clementine is this sort of centralized idea that I'm using to sort of personify this idea, but ultimately it's a set of various systems that interact with each other, and eventually something will form that is cohesive out of that. I have taken a long time to get to this point where I'm accepting decentralization, and the reason is because I have had this sort of vision of a Jarvis-like digital assistant for a long time, and I've gone through at least 4 different iterations of some kind of personal digital assistant, and that sort of culminated in building an autonomous agent, which became Simple Agent. And then Simple Agent, I forked and created my own personalized version of it, because again, it's a template that you can use. And it's just a little bit not there yet. And it can do a lot of different things, but it still gets hung up on certain problems. And so it's just important to remember that there is a limit to what autonomous agents are going to be able to do in the near term. They can do a lot, but keep in mind the decentralization aspect of it. I've built a lot of these systems where I tried to build a cohesive single digital assistant. It's ultimately going to be a bunch of different systems integrated together, and they might merge at some point in the future, but think of the overall digital secretary as being the integration between Google Calendar, between Discord, between Google Tasks, or whatever task management software you decide to use, your project management software, your smart home in and of itself, your messaging applications, your email. All of these different things can be managed by automations that you create, and you can think of that whole system, even though it is decentralized, it's not just one application, you can think of that whole system as your digital secretary. Now, with that said, I've stayed on this slide way too long, so I want to talk about where AI actually does apply, because this is the really big value, and why I'm talking about productivity in the modern age, is because I have looked into productivity systems before, like Getting Things Done, for example, and Getting Things Done was designed to write down ideas on paper. It was designed for pen and paper, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with writing things down on paper and reviewing your system every week, etc., etc. But the issue with Getting Things Done is that it is a little bit outdated, and it doesn't work for somebody like me, or at least it didn't. And we can go back to the idea of discipline being fundamental to your productivity system, because if I was more disciplined, I could probably have made Getting Things Done work. But the amount of stimuli that we take in is enormous, and it's important to be able to filter that. And so a lot of what LLMs and what AI can do at this point is filter that information, curate that information for you on your behalf, and then present filtered, curated, complex information to you in a way that is ultimately very, very useful. Another thing that it can do is actually perform abstract decision making. It's not if else, it is here's the situation, what should we do going forward? You can use LLMs as general purpose models that can make decisions based on any sort of text that if you can convert something to text and you can present a situation, then you can receive a human-like approximation of what the answer to that prompt would be, which means you can do abstract decision making. Now, I would say, and I have another video on navigating the wall that AI seems to be pushing up against and also to navigate the next decade or so of model performance and how to actually integrate language models into your applications successfully. I have a video on that I'll link below where we talk about how how the different ranges between how sometimes the complexity of the task is going to matter in terms of where models are going to perform well and where they're not going to perform well. So in terms of abstract decision making, I have a video on where you might want to apply abstract decision making and where you might not want to, but for our purposes, you can think of abstract decision making as a way for your automated systems and the roads that you're creating between these different applications, for that all to be managed and for information to flow from one to the other. So think of abstract decision making as a way to manage information and sort information and curate it for you, and that goes into the complex filters and curation idea from before. With that said, there's also another application for AI, which is building a persona. Now, this is an idea that I've seen kind of floated around between a few different places. One of those places is dating apps. There was an idea from the Bumble founder, whose name I cannot remember, but she had this idea of a digital concierge where you would log into the app, you would give an idea of your personality, and then a digital version of you based on an LLM, basically prompted to have your personality, would go out and interact with other digital concierge. And then those would kind of create those recommendations for you on your behalf. Now, a lot of people call that the super dystopian idea. It may be, but I like the idea of that as a recommendation algorithm. And the reason why I'm talking about that here is because when you have something like a digital persona, then it can go out and it can make those complex decisions that we talked about on your behalf. And it can make recommendations to you on your behalf based on what your actual personality is. And when we talked about shiny objects earlier, that was largely based on interest, and that was largely based on your personality. And that personality being replicated at least to some degree by an approximation engine like an LLM is going to be incredibly useful for designing these systems that are custom made and tailored to you. So at that point, once it is capable of sort of of replicating your personality to some degree, then it can start to anticipate needs and understand your thought processes to the degree where the entire system can mold to you in a way that was never available before. Now, it's important to remember, because that can sound really creepy, that it's still just a statistical approximation. This is all just math that's going on, and it might be math that some people will try to convince you is approaching human level intelligence. In reality, it's still just a bunch of linear algebra running on a computer or a chipset somewhere in a data center, or if you're running it locally, it's running on that chipset, and it is capable of approximating how you might act, but it can only do that based on learned parameters. And so it's important to remember that it's just a bunch of math. It doesn't actually have the ability to replicate you. It doesn't have the ability to learn based on that. It doesn't have the ability to actually like try to take over your life or anything like that. It's just a statistical approximation. And while it is a bit of a black box, so you should be careful, it's not that creepy, at least for me, when I think of it as just a bunch of math. I think that it's just really useful and basically a way to create your own personalized recommendation algorithm. With that said, we already kind of talked about this, but there's a big AI pie in the sky that it's important to avoid. Jarvis may be real someday, but it is enormously complex. If you're thinking about, first of all, a CEO, if you look at what Jarvis was in like the Iron Man series, Jarvis was this super intelligent business management thing that was capable of not just running an entire company and automating every part of that, but also being a decentralized system where it could simultaneously manage a bunch of different electronics and robots and such, but it was also capable of like handling defense and then taking initiative and anticipating needs, etc., etc. It was a digital butler on steroids, and Jarvis is a super cool idea. It may be real someday, but it is enormously complex. And so what we were talking about earlier is that you need to take 100 small steps. You have to take 100 small steps to get there. That is the decentralization aspect. You're paving a bunch of these different roads between parts of your life and integrating everything, and eventually something will emerge from that you can call a Jarvis-like system. But the key is still decentralized development towards an eventual goal. So continue to automate and delegate so that you can work most on what you can do that no one else can. Now that we've gone over everything, that was a lot of stuff to talk about. So if you forget everything else, these are the things to kind of remember. First, the key isn't perfection. It's to get back on the horse when you fall off. A productivity system, like we said, should not be this perfect thing that you have to adhere to every single time. Perfection is not the key. What is the key is to just keep moving forward. If you take a step back, you'll eventually take another couple forward. So the idea is to just get back on the horse when you fall off, not to try to be perfect. Productivity systems are something that has been I would say an obsession of the tech industry for decades. And before that as well. It's something that has been we just talked about a big pie in the sky. The ultimate productivity app, the ultimate productivity system, it doesn't really exist. It all comes down to you. So build the system that works for you and then just try to stay consistent with it. If you fall off, if you can't stay consistent with it, just try to get back on when you can. And don't be too hard on yourself, because the goal is eventually to get things done. And don't forget that goal, because the goal is eventually to actually get things done. It's not to drone over the productivity system itself. Your goal isn't to create this ultimate productivity system so that theoretically you could get stuff done. Your goal is to actually do those things, and your productivity system getting in the way of that is a sign that your productivity system shouldn't exist at all. Now, that said, obviously there's going to be a little bit of overlap, so don't forget that there's going to be some overhead from just creating a productivity system and then getting used to it in and of itself. But if you get used to it and you create your productivity system and then you just feel like it's another thing for you to do, just try to remember that the goal is to make it easier for you to get things done, not harder. That always comes down to constant refinement. Be flexible and be open to change. The entire thing is going to go through multiple iterations probably. You might cut out entire components of your system, but ultimately be flexible, be open to change, and keep the eventual goal in mind, and you're going to be good to go. With that said, thank you so much for watching, if indeed you watched the whole thing. And I will see you next time. Thank you.